India is the world's fastest growing economy, and the US is the world's largest. India is the world's largest democracy, and the US is the world's oldest. And the age-old question remains, which is better? We're going to compare the two countries across a few different factors: quality of life, freedom, spirit, community, jobs, infrastructure, and so many other things. And before I begin, for those of you who don't know me, namaste, my name is Avanti, and at this point, I've lived exactly half my life between the two countries. Quick context check. I was born in the US, in Boston, and I lived there till I was about 9. Then I moved to India, specifically Mumbai, with my family when I was about 9. I did middle and high school in India. Then I went back to the US for college. Ever since graduating, I've gone back and forth between the two. I do want to specify that my experience in both is not a holistic representation of the country, because I've been in very specific cities in both. I've been in more metro cities in India, spending most of my time between Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore, and simply visiting other places. And even within the US, I've spent most of my time in the Northeast, so Boston, New York, California. So transparently, I cannot speak to Middle America or Middle India's experiences. What I'm sharing is simply from my lens as a global individual, and my thoughts having spent meaningful time in both places, and honestly, feeling both a sense of apnapan and also feeling kind of paraya, because my experiences in both places have been incredibly unique, and I feel so connected to both, but also kind of disconnected in a way that I think is both good because it gives me an objective lens, and bad because I know who I am and I know what makes me me. But I think people in this world feel a need to put you into a box and understand who you are and where you come from. Your past and your roots are equally as important as your future and what you choose to do with it. I actually do have a favorite between the two places, which maybe you'll get to know by the end of the video. So without further ado, let's get into it. First, let's talk about the quality of life. Now, it depends on your definition of what you feel the quality of life is. There's no denying that currently in India, the quality of life when it comes to air quality, when it comes to overcrowding, and when it comes to pollution is not the best. Versus in the US, your air quality is much better, your pollution is much lower, and it is just a less densely populated country, so you have more space and therefore potentially better quality. But that's where it comes all down to what is your definition of quality. This kind of comparison pretty much anybody knows and is aware of. But let's dig a little bit deeper. The US just recently pulled out of the Paris Treaty, which is a treaty meant to reduce global carbon emission and reduce the global warming temperature, and collectively reduce the world's temperature as we combat global warming. With the US pulling out of the Paris Treaty, what that actually means is their carbon emissions are likely going to go up. And what's a little bit deceptive about the pollution and emissions angle with the US is they actually produce more emissions and more waste. They just have better regulations around how to curb it or make it visible to the population. So you may not experience it as an everyday citizen, but the US does have more emission and more waste than India does. But India's regulations right now and dealing with its developing status is kind of going crazy. So we really need to figure out how to put regulations and curbs into place to curb our emissions, curb our waste, and have better systems around recycling, waste management, energy efficiency. And as one of the signatories of the Paris Treaty, I think we have a good chance at figuring out how to do that. Because if you go back into the 1970s, 80s, and you compare, say, a city like Mumbai and a city like New York, both of which have a very similar vibe, back in the 70s and 80s, as New York was developing more, there was a lot of air, water pollution, and so many other factors. And so to be honest, it's kind of unfair to compare air pollution, smog. Even in the 70s and 80s, the US was considered a developed nation. India is still developing, so it's kind of unfair to compare developing nation, because this is true of all major developing cities across the world with what the US is today. But, it's really important that we learn from how New York dealt with curbing this. We learn from how other major cities, say Hong Kong, Beijing, dealt with our pollution. Otherwise, we are going to end up in a very tricky situation. Spoken about quality of life in terms of access to space and air and all of these things. Also access to parks, areas to play. Again, there's a lot of parts of India that do have that, but they're just not in necessarily the places that have the economic opportunity yet. Similarly, the US has that in vastness and has figured out a way to introduce that even into their cities, which I think is a really important thing. But I think quality of life sometimes goes deeper than that, which we choose to ignore. And quality of life also means, in my opinion, the people around us, their spirits, their attitudes, and the impact you could have. And that brings us to the age-old question of interdependent versus independent living. In India, people are nosy, yes. People are in your business, yes. There are people around almost always, yes. But that also means people care. That also means that you don't feel alone. And I don't mean necessarily lonely, because you can feel lonely in a large crowd too. There is a sense of interdependence in the ecosystem that functions in India that you may not even see at its core. That you may not even notice if you've grown up there your whole life. It's as simple as the milkman coming in the morning, to the recycling collector or the raddiwala, to how kind your building's watchman might be, to you waving to anybody on the street, to your community knowing each other, knowing that you can check in on somebody, and there will almost always be somebody to check in on you. Is it a lot? Yes. But is it interdependent? Is it this ecosystem? Is it this bubbling, thriving, living organism that you can choose to partake in? Yes. In the US, on the other hand, do you have a sense of independence? Yes, absolutely. But does that mean that people live their lives, sometimes never interacting with other people? Yes. Does that mean that everyone kind of has to do everything themselves, or are expected to, or that's the norm in the culture? Yes, and while that is a good skill to have, I think there's a beauty in collectivism and bringing people together and living in a sense of community, because if you think about it, no matter what culture you're from, that's what we originated from. We originated with the sense of community, wanting to give back, wanting to be there, and both exist in both places. But it's more about what is the ethos of a place. And I want to be very clear that independence does not necessarily mean freedom. When I was younger, I would have potentially argued that you had more freedom in a country like the US. But given what's happening, as a woman especially, I feel like I have much more freedom in a place like India. Now, I'm kind of scared for what freedom means in the US when your reproductive rights are being taken away. So many parts of the US, I as a woman don't have a say over my own body, what I choose to do with my body, and how I choose to regulate it. That is my choice as an individual. Different people have different approaches, but that should be your choice as an individual. Along with freedom comes the aspect of safety. And do I feel safe in the US? The short answer is not really. The threat of gun violence is one thing, but honestly, actually being in a more independent society sometimes makes me feel less safe. Because I would argue that in the US, I probably feel safest in a place like New York, because there's people around. If you've ever been to a location where at night there aren't enough people around, it's really hard to feel a sense of safety. I honestly don't know how much freedom of expression is going to be as much of a fundamental right in the US anymore. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like I have this rose-colored vision of India that it is the most free land in the world. I'm highly aware that it is not. And I'm also highly aware that in both places I come from a sense of privilege where I can't even begin to understand the deeper-rooted senses of freedom that somebody else from a different socioeconomic class, race, caste, or other marginalized background might feel. So I want to, at the outset, say that I recognize that this is a more privileged perspective. With that caveat, I do think that in India, while there's aspects of freedom of expression that might be curbed in certain parts of the country, just as there are in certain parts of the country in the US. Generally speaking, I feel safer in a place like India, and it's mostly because of the people, of the fact that I know that I have my rights, I have general safety, and I know that comes with a huge layer of privilege. But even at a general level, the sense of freedom and safety, I think, comes with a sense of community. And I do think in my own lifetime, I've seen India become more open. I've seen it become more free. I've seen a lot of my NRI friends and their families and parents specifically be stuck in what I like to call cultural freeze, which is they're stuck in this idea of India from the 70s, 80s, or whenever they immigrated, and don't see it in its light today. And I mean, honestly, I could go on a whole rant about that, which I might at some point if you're interested, why I think a lot of diaspora is stuck in that zone. But I think a lot of that freedom that I'm talking about also comes from spirit and also comes from the fact that both countries are changing quite rapidly. India is the youngest country in the world. We have about 650 million people under the age of 25 and rapidly growing. And that takes me to, from freedom, let's go to the sense of spirit. I think the underlying spirit of India lies in its resilience, in its kindness, in its multiculturalism, diversity, and most importantly, in its jugaad. Jugaad, for the uninitiated, is this sense of scrappiness and this sense of DIY, being able to get shit done no matter what the solution needs to be. It can also mean a band-aid solution, and I think jugaad is India's biggest boon and also could be its biggest downfall. I think if we take the spirit of jugaad but building long-term adaptability, then the world doesn't know what's coming for it. There's such a blessing within that. I think the US, definitely one of the biggest innovating ecosystems still today in the world, some of the biggest technological innovations. There's so much to learn from them, and honestly, I think one of the core facets about the US is the ability to tell a story. Nobody can do it like the US can, which is they can take anything in the entire world, whether it's a product, a human, anything, they can sell it, they can tell the story so well. Might not even have substance, but they can tell the story so well that it makes you intrigued and interested. I think both can learn from each other in those ways. But let me illustrate an example of what I mean by the jugaad mentality of in India versus the lakir ke fakir, or stuck in their own systems and more rigid ways of the US. If I were to go to a shop at the end of the day, the shop closes at 8 p.m. and it is 7:55. I can go to a shop in India and say, hey, I really need a pink pen. In India, even if the shopkeeper does not own the pink pen, they'll be like, hold on 1 second, I will figure this out for you. They'll go buy a pink pen from somebody else and then sell it to you. If I go at 7:55 to a closing shop or a closing store in the US, I ask for a pink pen and they don't have a pink pen, they simply do not have a pink pen. And they simply do not care. And that's okay. They can almost afford not to care. And India is in a place where they need to have that resilience, but what's concerning to me is how that's also seeped into, I think, a younger population in the US, which is the sense of not necessarily having that same drive and that same ambition and resilience. And of course, there's ecosystems that push that ambition to some degree. I did my undergrad at Harvard, which is arguably an ecosystem that should push or at least attract a lot of people with a lot of high ambition, and it does. My classmates were amazing. But I think so many of them ended up entering a system of complacency where I thought that the people in the world who likely have the biggest safety net in the world and have the biggest ambition should also have the biggest scrappiness and goal to build and whatever it is. And when I say build, you don't have to be a startup founder necessarily, but I found that a majority of my classmates take the simple path. It's hard, but simple in terms of least resistance. And that honestly made me a little bit sad. And I see that attitude seeping into the ecosystems of both as well. Let's talk about industry a little bit, right? India has a booming tech, e-commerce, startup ecosystem. We introduced something called UPI, a Unified Payments Interface, a unified payment system, which is widely accessible across socioeconomic backgrounds and instant transactions, especially for the underbanked or the unbanked population. It's crazy to me that something like that does not exist in the US. Yes, you have Apple Pay, but whether it's the banking systems, whether it is honestly any daily thing enabled by, any daily task enabled by tech, or just this idea that we're going, not necessarily in a hustle culture way, but in a way of, yeah, we need to innovate on the daily. I don't see that in the US. I see it in the Valley, Silicon Valley. I see it in some of these academic institutions, some of these cities. I see it in the way that they're building enterprise B2B SaaS technology. But that's limited pockets. I'm talking about the general principle of the person, and it probably comes from a scarcity mindset where I would say the average Indian teenager today is hungrier than the average American teenager today across fronts. And that does come from a sense of scarcity versus baseline comfort. But that scares me because we used to think of the US as the American dream. Anyone can make it happen. You come for the land of opportunity. And I just frankly don't think the US is that land of opportunity anymore in the same way. Because let's talk about jobs, right? The job market all over the world is very difficult right now for multiple factors. And I will say, because I know some of you watching this video might be, do I build a career in India or do I build a career in the US? And my 2 cents would be, if you're looking for a regular job in a high-paying career or a field that you know pays well, such as say tech or finance or even consulting, a regular job, you're probably going to get more opportunity and more pay in the US. And that's just true, and the reality of the system. But that also comes to our first argument, what is quality of life, which we will bring it back to. But if you're looking to build anything, a small business, a startup, anything, it doesn't have to be a startup or an entrepreneur in the traditional sense. But if you're looking to build in any way, I think India is one of the best places to build in the world today for many, many reasons. And you see this in terms of more foreign money being poured into investing into the ecosystem here. You see this in terms of more people deciding to come here and build. And so if you want to build anything, I think India is a great place to be. If you want to work in a more traditional corporate ecosystem, the US is still a great place to be. That also takes us to the layer that we were talking about in the beginning about the quality of life. And you may earn more in the US, but you will have to spend way more in the US too. You may earn less in India, but your cost of living is much, much lower. Now, I recognize that cities like Mumbai, especially, if not even Delhi and Bangalore, are becoming very high cost of living, particularly with real estate and many other factors. So that is something to take into account as well. But the cost of living in terms of just your daily groceries, your daily spend, the ability to access people, enjoy, commute, infrastructure. There's a lot of pros and cons on both sides. The US has more developed infrastructure in some cases, but in a majority of the country, honestly, with the exception of New York and maybe a couple other cities, public transport system sucks, if doesn't exist. And so you have to own a car, and you have to be able to access these high ticket items to be able to access mobility, which is hard. Whereas in India, that's not necessarily the case in a lot of places. Public transport, generally speaking, in a lot of parts of the country is accessible. But of course, when we go to more semi-urban rural areas, it's a little bit trickier, but that's when community comes into play, and you can't get from point A to point B. You don't have to own a cart. You can hail somebody's bullock cart. And while that is not infrastructure in and within itself, it's just comes down to that spirit again. And the last thing I will mention is that both countries are actually incredibly multicultural and diverse, but it depends on how we think of them. India, every couple hundred kilometers, you have different languages, cultures, backgrounds, religions, and I think that is the beauty and power of India. I did this project over this last year where we did 50 songs in 50 different languages from places all over the world, and we covered a lot of Indian ones, and it was such an amazing learning experience. And there's so much power in owning your identity and also learning from each other's. And I think that is the power India needs to step into. The US was built by immigrants. The US was built by people coming to a land of opportunity, the racial, cultural, economic diversity, and it's sad to me how politics, honestly, in both countries are turning that as power against each other rather than harnessing the beauty that there is in that. I think both have that aspect of multiculturalism that is so beautiful and deserves to be harnessed. I do think that there's also huge scope for bilateral trade, economically, culturally, and in so many other facets between the countries. And I'm realizing that this video turned into more of a rant than I intended it to be. I thought I would systematically go about each one, but I was excited about the US's past, but I'm really excited about India's future. And I do think personally, it's why I've actually chosen to move to India and build a base here, build here, and really excited to share what and where, and how and why. If you're interested, I can make a video talking about why I chose to move here and have this be my primary base. But obviously, a lot of it's to do with the factors in this video, but also many, many more subtle ones. But in any case, I think there's beauty in comparing places, but mostly from the perspective of how can we all learn from each other? What can we learn from the US? What can the US learn from us? How do we grow as a world? And especially as a young person, how can you make the most of contributing, giving back, living the best life possible, and the sense of purpose that is one of the most expensive things in the world is finding that sense of purpose. That sense of purpose can come from identity, freedom, community, building, contributing, small unit family, large unit family, doesn't matter. But that to me is the core thing, and wherever you feel a deeper sense of purpose, I think is a deeper way to approach if you're considering between places, whether that's different cities, countries, or whatever it might be. Anyway, I shall end this rant here, but I've not sat and talked to a camera like this in a while. It's felt fun. It's felt scary again, which makes no sense because I've been doing this for years, but sometimes putting that muscle back in action is important. If you'd like for me to talk about more topics around creativity, culture, community, many other things that are brewing, I will. I'm so excited to share more, which I will in a few months. But yeah, let me know in the comments below what would be useful, what you'd like to see. I can also do a whole download of where we're at in life right now. And yeah, for anyone new here, thank you for watching. And if you watched till the end, please comment below the word khichdi, which basically means this, it's like this all-in-purpose rice dish which you throw everything in, because that's what I feel identity is today. And that's how I know you have been watching till the end. Lots and lots of love, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.